Hi, Matthew.
Hi,
Welcome to the show.
thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, I'm after our exploration call, which could have been an entire podcast episode as such, actually.
Yes, definitely.
I'm very much looking forward to explore the topics of uncertainty and safe enough space and neurodiversity.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. And before getting started, when did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
It's an interesting one. I think facilitation has always been a part of my work. One of the interesting things about exploring framing work in my own terms is how much I've realized I've always done some of these things, and it's always been a thread in my work. However, even now, facilitation is a part of my work rather than the whole of my work. So um, it's a really interesting one. And I tend to, facilitator is part of a chain of things I describe myself as.
Mm.
Um, but as an individual, and I have been doing that, including that in my description explicitly for around 3 years now.
And when you facilitate, what do you do? What do you understand by facilitation?
So for me, I think of facilitation as a process of creating a context where something helpful can emerge and creating that context so that we kind of so that that thing is in a certain direction
Mm.
and is in a way that is likely to be at an appropriate level for the people who are attending, so is not going to be too trivial and too boring and is not going to be too much and too overwhelming. So it's a context and a calibration, I think, is probably the best way I would describe it.
Mm. And two words come to my mind. One is design work and design effort to make
Mm,
sure that you're walking this very thin path
mm,
between too little and too much. And the other one is actually already directly hitting to our um, topic, which is uncertainty.
mm,
Because you said that, how did you phrase it? That set the stage where things can happen,
mm,
but must not happen. So
mm.
it sounds like something that is out of control.
Absolutely. And I think this gets to the idea of control and facilitation sit very uncomfortably together. You can't
Mm,
facilitate and be fully in control. And the
mm,
design is a really interesting word because I think of it as an active design process, a co-created design process at that, because whenever you're facilitating, you're not doing so in a kind of abstract space. You're doing so in relationship to a whole load of people responding and reacting in certain ways. And quite a lot of the skill is being able to listen in all
mm,
senses to what's going on and kind of go with that or not go with that, and making those decisions is, do I want to kind of go with the flow of where everyone else is taking this, or do I want to influence and do I want to nudge this in a different direction? And for me, that influence, that nudging, is the space, the thing we have in uncertainty that is comparable to control when we have a deterministic space, a known space.
mm,
So that ability to, because I think the fear, one of the core fears of uncertainty is if we're in uncertainty, there's nothing we can do. We're kind of completely, like just completely lost in the flow of things, and there's nothing we can do. And what we can't do is choose absolute, but we can have very significant influence.
mm. And that's why uncertainty causes stress to many, because it's something that we cannot control, as opposed to risk. And we discussed about this,
Mm,
difference between risk and uncertainty in the exploration. And I would be curious before we we talk maybe also about the difference, or maybe you want to share your thoughts about the difference of risk and uncertainty, and then maybe explain how, where you see the uncertainty, how to deal with the uncertainty, because there are two ways to look at that. It's uncertainty for the facilitator, because you don't know what's going to happen in the space, and there's the uncertainty of the participants. And for both parts, it's uncomfortable very often.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we can, I will come back to that. Yeah, it will be really good to come back to a lot of the ideas around that. And I might appreciate you bringing me back to that if I don't get back there my own accord. However, yeah, that difference between risk and uncertainty. So this came from my own inner exploration and some comparison with psychology literature, really, and my realization that I've often been told I have a high kind of appetite for risk. I've never experienced myself as having a high appetite for risk. And that's not just a kind of calibration thing. That's not because I feel differently. I actually don't have a high taste for many of the things that people consider risky, in the sense of there being a known thing at stake. So risk, a good example of risk is gambling in a casino. You know what is at stake, you know what the odds are, and you know what the range of possible outcomes are. So you've got all of those different kind of possibilities. It's risk. I don't actually enjoy that very much at all. Also, don't like roller coasters. I don't have a high appetite for risk, but I really like uncertainty. I love spaces where we don't even know kind of where this is going fully yet.
And what the odds are.
What the odds are, exactly. And you cannot know the odds in uncertainty. That's the whole point. That's kind of what makes it uncertainty as opposed to risk, is you can't quantify. Or if you do try and quantify, it takes you longer than it's either useful, or by the time things have changed already. And quite often you see this in organizations trying to really pin down when they talk about risks in project management, and they're actually talking about uncertainty, and then the whole project inception phase takes the whole time and all the resources of the project, because it's trying to pin something down that can't be pinned down. And that's a really, really difficult kind of situation. So unpicking this idea of what is risk, what is knowable, reasonable to know, and we can quantify, versus uncertainty, which is much more in this space of intuition and a felt sense of the thing. And for me, that's a much more interesting space. So I have a very high uncertainty appetite, but actually a very low risk appetite. So once risks are known and quantified, I'm very careful. Before they are, I'm, by most people's standards, downright reckless.
And I think that's important for the audience also to hear when we go further in the conversation, that basically in a workshop, there are very few situations that are really risky in that sense. Because we're not tossing coins, we're not gambling, but there's a high amount of uncertainty where we're leaning in, we're exchanging information, we're putting all these brains and creativities together, and something may or may not come out of that.
Absolutely. It's absolutely about what emerges. It's this emergence from a complex interaction. And that is necessarily, by definition, if you're using complex, it kind of in its technical way, is unknowable before it happens.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it's absolutely the space of uncertainty.
And hence, I would assume that intuition, as you mentioned, plays a huge role. And there are some who feel more confident to follow and listen to their intuition than others. So this might be a proxy to an appetite for uncertainty.
Absolutely. I think there are those of us who have been led to this simply because of having a high interest. You know, we become practiced at being in these spaces because we've always been led to them. I didn't even realize for most of my career that a lot of the things that I was doing weren't typical of people. Because I have this attraction, I would always choose the really big, messy, difficult problems that everyone else wouldn't touch, because they were kind of, they were really bad for your career in many ways. Actually, for me, they weren't, because I had a different set of skills to work with. But for many people, they would be a real problem, because they're already messy, and the work is to get to an understanding, get to a clarity, get to words, get to models that you can then test and see how true they are, rather than being able to kind of take a known model and optimize how you solve that problem, which is it's a different way of thinking, and it's a different domain. And I think there are people who have skills across both, and it's really important to highlight that. But if you have more skills in this kind of uncertain domain, then it's actually quite difficult to find really fulfilling work in normal organizations.
Very true. Unless you have the opportunity to work in this creative space, where the image that came to my mind while you were describing was that if we have an appetite for uncertainty, then we are more open to follow new ideas or path just out of curiosity. And then I think, by definition, those who are open enough to follow that and then to be nimble to adjust are then also more successful in following this path. And the image that came to my mind was almost like when we're really cold, and then we tense our bodies, and then we feel even more cold. The only way to actually feel more comfortable in the cold is to relax. And then suddenly it doesn't feel that cold anymore. And I think with uncertainty, it's similar. The more we resist and try to control, because we might confuse it with risk, the more we actually resist it and won't find answers or won't find a creative solution. Whereas when we let go and surrender, there's an entire world of opportunities opening up.
Absolutely. I think that response, how we respond in those situations is really interesting. I would say there is, the vast majority of people narrow under stress. They become cognitively narrow. If you read the psychology literature, they'll say everyone does. I'm starting to wonder whether there are a smaller group of people, and this links us to neurodiversity, whose default is cognitive breadth. I'm probably in that group, and a lot of people who end up in facilitation are in this group, partly because this quality of being in between and making connections is more important than any of the individual nodes, any of the individual things. If you're kind of given to this way of thinking, it's a different thing. And so when under like real severe stress to make a decision, the majority of people will narrow down and will see a very, very narrow set of options. My experience is that under significant stress, I have a kind of freeze response because I see every possibility at once, and it's overwhelming to act upon. But it's kind of the same and kind of the opposite. So it's an interesting, the way that we're processing that and being in the space with others who might be doing it differently is an awful lot of, there's a kind of almost like a music to facilitation. That's part of the work and part of the skill. But it's not quite like being a conductor, because you're kind of there with people. So it's more like being you're playing along with people rather than conducting and not playing at the same time.
So it's more like jazz.
Yeah.
And then I wonder, and I haven't forgotten the other question about uncertainty for the facilitator and the groups. I still wonder, how can you then provide or share the set of opportunities that you see with a group that most probably doesn't see that, but is prone or has an instinct to narrow down? Because
So
there's a translation effort, actually.
yes, and this is why it is work. This is why it is a specific sort of work. Though for many of us, it's work we practice just to get by. I think this is one of the interesting things: is if we do experience the world differently in any way, to interact with the conventional world, we're always making that effort, and so we get very practiced at it. I think a surprising amount of the very highly developed professional expertise in a lot of domains comes from that. Having spent time in psychology and psychiatry and psychotherapy spaces, very often there's a very, very high degree of empathy that comes with a lot of those roles. For me, the need to develop that high a level of empathy doesn't actually happen for most people. It's something that most people are so high, many people I meet who work in those domains are so highly developed in that capability, it can't just be professional. It can't just be something they've been doing, like they started learning at university and they just do in their day job. There is no way that is true. It's something that was already there. And for me, one of the really interesting things is, as an example with empathy, is I see empathy as a when I'm talking about empathy, I mean the kind of somatic ability to kind of feel something the same as someone else is feeling it, rather than sympathy, which is being able to match my experience to someone else's. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of, again, similar, but also a kind of opposite. And the reason that we need a high degree of empathy in everyday life is if we are experiencing things somewhat differently to others. So we develop that capacity. And it's a very interesting thing to look at neurodivergence and look at the extent to which there are neurodivergent traits in highly empathetic professions. Because it is, if you are neurodivergent, or actually from any other different background, but neurodivergent, you have, if you want to relate to people on their terms, to meet them that way, and there are strong incentives to do so, then developing a greater sense of empathy is one of the ways that you can do that, and one of the ways that you can stay safe in interaction. Because if you can read someone else's emotional state perhaps even more fluently than they can, you can edge into things that wouldn't otherwise be safe, because you don't have you don't know how they're going to react, because you don't share that common experience.
So if I understand correctly, you would then basically have to learn how to relate, how to be empathetic, how to read body language, facial expressions, and maybe even the tone of expression, like others would learn a new language.
Yes, on some level. I mean, I think it's more that when we're talking about hyperempathy, it's that there are that the language underneath, the physiological language, is actually much more in common. So we do have a point at which we experience things, on that fundamental somatic level, our embodiment is similar enough that we can relate on that level. But it's the other layers above. So it's that kind of language and how we're interacting level where that can often go wrong. So what we can do is we can then go back down to that base layer and keep monitoring that base layer where we can connect. It's just that most people don't have to do that most of the time. But if you experience the world differently, it can be a very helpful way of interacting and of staying safe. So the other group of people are people who've had to learn to do this in order to stay safe in their previous life. Because if you can monitor the other faster than they can, you can make sure that you never behave in ways that result in unsafe behavior towards you.
And therefore also create maybe a different sort of safe container for the group, because you're more aware, or you have actively practiced.
Yeah, and why, and the kind of fundamental underpinnings as to why you would get good at that are again because you had to, sometimes because you had to learn to monitor that space previously. You know, if you think about social situations and the difficulty of interacting in a group, for example, again, if you're slightly different and you stand out, you can manage the group in a certain way. You can see a lot of people who become stand-ups often have a similar, again, it's a way of managing the way that people are relating to you in a different way, but actually very closely related. You know, and so that way of, you know, how can I integrate, but you take on some of the, you know, the role that would in a more, in an equally skilled relationship be more equally located, and that means that you can take people to places that they haven't been yet. So
What do you
because
mean?
you have, if you have a bit more of a capacity in a space, you can take people there knowing that you can hold this. You know, your senses are attuned enough, your skills are strong enough that you can take people a bit further than they are fully comfortable. I often use the metaphor of a Sherpa. You know, it's like I can climb, a Sherpa climbs with the, you know, with the, very often with the, with the, traditionally with the kind of European white person, yet they've lived on the mountain all their lives, they've been up lots of mountains, and they're usually doing it carrying a pack, like carrying all the stuff, they're putting the ropes in, they're doing it, but nonetheless they are on the mountain with that person, so they are there and they are to some degree of risk. And so their awareness, their embodied knowing in that environment is actually a good deal of what protects the other person as well, because they're aware and they're like, okay, you know, it's that thing of like, that just feels wrong, that sounds wrong, or that's like, so we won't go that way, we'll go this way. That embodied knowing is something that you really kind of, yeah, that is, it is only experientially developed.
Yeah, definitely. And another thought that came to my mind is if the empathy part is a skill that you have trained and developed over time, but is not inherent or that you didn't grow up with, it might even be, correct me if I'm wrong, it's just an assumption, in the role of the facilitator, more able to actually design for an entire variety of diverse, for instance, groups with diverse appetite for uncertainty, because you don't assume that everyone is like you, or you don't connect to one specific part. Everyone is just different, and there's a variety of difference, and you're aware of that.
Yeah, so there's two things there. I think what I want to be clear on is that there is a higher degree of empathy, not because it was learned necessarily cognitively, but because it just had to arise in some neurodivergent people. So it's actually, it's a, yes, it's learnt, but it's learnt in the sense of the way that we learn things on a really fundamental level. So it's always been there. You
So
know,
the
it's
survival instinct kind of learning.
in the same way that which is the way that most people develop. You know, development is actually about survival, and it's just that those were the optimal pathways for some people. So they do have, it's, this is to differentiate it from the there are certain neurominorities that are associated with a detail orientated kind of observational way of understanding others, sometimes associated with autism spectrum because of the amazing capacity for detail that many people with autism spectrum possess. I'm not really talking about that necessarily, though that might be one of the pathways to it. I'm just talking about a very highly developed ability to read other people's kind of physiological emotional state, however that arises. That said, the other part of this, though, is that where you were talking about being able to design for others, yes, there is significant truth in that, partly because when we experience the world differently, however we experience the world differently, we regularly encounter reminders that the rest of the world doesn't. we have to swap our perspective all the time. It's what's called, in neurodivergent spaces, it's called masking. In some race theory spaces, it's called code switching. It's this capacity to shift whole perceptive frameworks, really, like full context, and operate in a different context. And if you exist in an entirely conventional existence, you may never encounter that at all until that point, and you certainly, if you do encounter it, it's very easy for you to walk away if you don't fancy it that day. Whereas for those of us who are different, we don't have that. It's either interact in the conventional terms or do not interact.
Mm.
And so, yeah. And so, but that gives an ability to kind of shift and play with perspective, and a perspective, almost a perspective on perspectives, to be able to play with all of them. And that's a really interesting thing in the space. Yeah.
And I would be very interested, maybe for the audience and also for me, to make sure that we really understand each other. What does neurodivergent actually mean, or what is your understanding of it when we continue speaking about it?
Sure. So I want to say this is my understanding, and the language around, like with a lot of difference, the language is constantly being changed and developed. The way I use it is that neurodiversity refers to the whole range of neurological differences, ways of being and experiencing the world that span the whole of human experience. So that's across all sorts of different dimensions as well. So that's the idea of neurodiversity. And one of the things is, people sometimes say someone is neurodiverse, but it's like, it's not really very helpful, because in a sense, everyone is diverse in their neural makeup. So what we tend to prefer to use is neurodivergent, which means, the way I use neurodivergent is to qualitatively and pervasively, so on an ongoing basis, experience the world in different ways than the majority of others around you.
So this could be in the extreme cases of autism and Asperger's, but it could as well include ADHD, dyslexia.
Those are the diagnoses tend to be called neurominorities. One of the ways to refer to them is as neurominorities. Some of the ways of experiencing the world differently kind of cluster together. They don't cluster perfectly, which is one of the interesting things around this. So different people with a common diagnosis might experience the world in quite significantly different ways on another dimension. This is one of the difficulties. It's like, there are so many degrees to which people differ, that yes, there are these clusters, and they kind of have some commonality of experience, but they also have quite big differences in experience. And some of the commonalities arise because they experience the world fundamentally differently. Some of the commonalities arise because when you interact with the world and you're just different neurologically, you have a similar experience. So the even though there's nothing in common underneath. And so there's an awful lot to tease apart there. Very often they come together, and you get it's very common to have, I tend to prefer the word co-occurrence rather than comorbidity, because it fits with this model, which is also related, actually, as you might hear me describe things as condition rather than disorder, because I see these things, when they are well developed, when they are allowed to develop well, when they have been given the right environment and nurture, I do not see any of these conditions as fundamentally a problem. They are just differences.
They could even be a gift.
They can be, in the right circumstances, they can be a gift, and in the wrong circumstances, they are the opposite. So it's in the right environment, these things can be a blessing, and in the wrong environment, they are undoubtedly a curse. So it's important to emphasize both of those things, and that it's an environmental thing. The other part of this is that because the world is not designed for people who experience the world this way, many people collect trauma-related disordered behavior on top of the condition, and it then follows a relatively consistent pattern. So you can have the underlying predisposition and be completely well, but many people, because they're not given the right developmental opportunities, end up with certain patterns of behavior that aren't helpful.
That are then rather referring to a shared trauma than to the same initial condition.
Absolutely. And so the work is, and this relates to, like, when we're talking about working with the condition, is like when we're talking about curing something or making it better, it's like, yes, we can address the disordered symptoms, but we're not trying to make the underlying functioning of a person different. It's like, you shouldn't be, it's not that you're experiencing things wrong, or it's like, how can you do this skillfully to the extent that anyone can do this skillfully, or to the extent that your capabilities allow.
And I would like to pick up the word design again and wonder, how can we then truly be inclusive? So assuming, and I hear about more and more cases, and I'm not sure whether this is maybe a trend where we tend to overdiagnose, or whether it's something that is now coming to awareness, so we spend more time to actually diagnosing. But the fact is that I realized that it becomes more and more relevant to think of our designs of how we create group conversations and workshops from a perspective of inclusion to neurodivergent participants.
Absolutely. I'd like to say on the kind of diagnosis and growing, like, I suspect there are multiple factors at work here. We're getting better at spotting these conditions. We're naming them in ways that they weren't always named before. They were sometimes described as other things, sometimes positively, sometimes not positively, usually around intersectional power and the fact that, like, if you were born an aristocrat, you would kind of be a creative free spirit, whereas if you were born working class, you would be indolent and work shy. And now we might call both of those conditions something in the space around ADHD. So it's like, how, there's all sorts of, like, these traits have been around for a long time. This is always a story. It's always a way of describing. It's not the absolute truth. It's just a situated way of getting a handle on something that's the infinite complexity and wonder of human experience. So that's one part of it. Another part of it, I believe, is that there are certain social factors that increase the instance of neurodivergent existence within the range of neurodiversity. And I suspect that seems to be correlated with social stress, social level stress, societal level stress. And because we are in a period of significant social level stress at the moment, it makes sense that more people are becoming neurodivergent. And I have a sense that on a functional level, it makes sense that if things are working really well, we don't need to change very much. Whereas if things aren't working so well, as measured by physiological stress, then it makes sense to try different things. And in many ways, a lot of neurodiversity is more profoundly expressed traits that exist in the whole of society.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. So, for example, the kind of detail orientation that often comes with autism spectrum condition is there in many people. It's just that it's more strongly expressed. We all have some of it, or almost all of us have some of it. It's just that it becomes such a big, potent thing that that you can't not do it. The kind of linking thought that often goes with ADHD and dyslexia to some degree, everyone can kind of make these linked thoughts, but the extent to which they happen, such that they become overwhelming, only seems to happen with a smaller group of people. So it's like these traits are already there, and some people don't really have them as problematic at all. Some people have them to a subclinical level, so they're just there and they're kind of constantly kind of below consciousness, and they have a drag on their experience. And then some people have them all the way to the point at which they struggle to maintain functionality within a conventional world. And there are also those people who find that they bounce between being kind of functional and not, and find it very exhausting, but can play the game or not. And that gets to kind of, after a fairly long divergence, to answer another question, is part of the value of this from a design perspective is that one of the ways to see these things is as particular sensitivities. So you could see ADHD as a real high sensitivity to context, social and physical context. That's why it's distractible, is because if the context shifts, so does the attention. So the context, so you can see it through the lens as a sensitivity. Now, the thing about sensitivity is we often talk about sensitivity as a problem. Yeah, it's very often problematized. It's like too sensitive, or shouldn't be sensitive to this, whatever. Sensitivity well expressed is the root of all expertise. So the way, one of my favorite examples is, who wants an insensitive surgeon? We need high sensitivity to be able to do really fine work, and to be able to work to a really high level, and to be able to work safely at a really high level. So from a design perspective, this plays out as being able to work with problems that other people wouldn't necessarily be able to work with, and resolve them, and in doing so fix the problem for all the other people who have that trait, but just not that much.
And so so much to unpack. What I heard about you first said that a few of the conditions get revealed through the stress, the social stress we're going through, or maybe we tend to have these conditions although we are not in the neurodivergent space, and the level of details or being absorbed by details, I think, is a very good example, because I think that's almost an automatic reaction of the brain when it comes to too much uncertainty, too much stress, information overload, and then it's easier. It's like a refuge to focus on the details. And the other thing that you mentioned is about the context switching, that this becomes a problem. And I think both are situations that we face very often in workshops with our work, where I think of an exercise, for instance, where we take a problem to the moon. So how would we solve this problem on the moon, which is a very extreme context switch that works for, what do you call them, neuronormal people? Neurotypical, thank you, of course. Neurotypical participants, but then might, if I understand you correctly, really put off those who might have ADHD or who have a strong preference for a stable context to operate in.
So this is where it gets. I think you're more likely to just to differentiate with ADHD because of that context switching, and partly because of this capability of that I talked about, where you develop skills. It's actually like radical context switches are something that people with ADHD get very comfortable with. It's why many people with ADHD find strength working in creative industries, in spaces where you have to think completely on your feet, improvise, make stuff up, why they tend to be very good in a crisis, because the existing rules don't apply. You're more likely to find that level of context switch to be difficult for people with more who are with more sensitivity to concrete thinking and literal thinking, which is more commonly associated with ASC. But you can also think about this, in terms of, rather than thinking about just the spaces, if you think about a continuum and you think about the normal operating window of a neurotypical participant, that's going to be a certain width, right? We can all go so far into detail, and we can all go so far into big picture connecting. What's interesting about neurodivergent people is they might have a really, really big operating window, but it might be very much at one end. So it might be that they can go completely off into space. You might find if you do that thing, you'll find someone in there who's like, well, yeah, okay, the moon. So what if we went to Mars? What if we went to Jupiter, where the gravity is really heavy? What if we went to Venus, where it's really hot? What if we did it on the sun? What if we did it in deep space? I give an example because I can do, this is like, and who would just follow that thread instead of actually doing the exercise and get kind of completely derailed by just playing with the context. That's one example. Or you might find someone who has a kind of freeze response. It's like, I can't do that. I don't have enough concrete stuff to work with.
Or would ask many questions about the conditions on Mars to actually do the exercise.
Yeah, or would want can we look up Wikipedia and look at what it is like on the moon and go from, so the operating window might actually be really large, and the person who struggles with going might be able to descend into details much further than everyone else. The difficulty is that if you work at either end, a long way at either end, it can be quite lonely because you're the only one that can go there. And so you're kind of constantly like, you're being pushed up against not being able enough to go at one end. You're like, okay, we can't. And then they're like, oh, shut up about the details, or, oh, stop talking about all the different planets. And, it's like, or, it's that people can't go at the other end. So there's the breadth of the window, and then there's the placing of the window on the continuum as well. And they're two separate things. And if we mistake one for the other, we can make mistakes about people's capability.
And what comes up for me is that there's such an opportunity to integrate all these different views and perspectives, because at the end, that's what we want. And I know so many facilitators who complain that the ideas that are generated in a simple brainstorm are never creative enough, and very rarely people get out of the known to explore the never done before. So how can we tap into this potential without falling into the trap to either overemphasize or to even over label? So what are the tips and tricks to discover whether there is such potential in a group? Can we actually ask the question, or is it inappropriate? And if so, how to deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is often a question for facilitators as an individual, is what level of work do you enjoy? Do you actually want to be doing cutting edge work, or do you like doing something that's better known, and kind of bringing people to a level of performance within that space? Because both are entirely really important and really valid. It's a question of personal preference. So it's like, and also, you might, as an individual, know you have a bit of both of those, and that you want to schedule some of one and some of the other, and make sure that you're getting those needs met. Because I think, if we talk about things not being creative enough in a workshop, when you're the facilitator, there's only really one person who's at fault there. Though there are multiple ways that you can make that error. And one of them is just inviting the wrong people into the room. It's like if these people could not go there with you, then that's fine. And it's like, again, we go back to the Sherpa. If you're like a really, really good mountain climber and you're there with a bunch of people like just on the little hills, and they're like, getting tangled up in the ropes and falling over, and you're going to get annoyed if you want to be climbing Everest.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. But you need to know that about yourself and take that into account when you invite people into the room, and work out, be clear about the kind of people and the kind of capability and the kind of work that you're planning to do in that space.
So is there a way to be more inclusive by design?
So there, it's an interesting question. So for me, you really hit it when you mentioned integration. A lot of what we're talking about is the capacity for the individual and the group to integrate experiences. When I say integrate, I mean going from perceiving, experiencing on a physical, somatic level into thoughts, words, and actions fairly skillfully, hopefully. When I say skillfully, I mean in ways that cause that are that do more good than harm. You can't go for perfect, but skillful is more good than harm most of the time. And being able to integrate, being able to join that up is a lot of the thing. So is everyone in the group operating closely enough that they can join that up, that you can form that joined awareness where people's perceptions become facets of a whole, and that they can share and communicate? And can people on an individual level experience more and increase that window, their own operating window, and their comfort in doing so that they can become familiar with a bigger breadth of operating, or a more focused depth. And I think for me, but it's a difficult thing. You can't just take people to an understanding and expect it to go in and be able to use it. It's much more about that experiencing, and in the experiencing comes a lot of the integration. It really is, getting it into the body, into the bone. And that's why workshops are great. That's why we need them over just telling people how to do stuff in a book. If we could just tell people how to do stuff in a book, and we just trivially went from knowing something in our heads to being able to do it and enact it in real life, none of what this stuff would be necessary.
Because we do need the experience. So what I hear from what you just shared about how to integrate it or how to design for it is basically setting ground rules to create this space where nobody fears to be dismissed for their way of thinking. And at the same time, also have a rule that if someone needs too much details about the conditions on Mars, or wants to brainstorm about moving the problem to Saturn or to the sun instead, that you also have clear rules of saying, okay, that might be interesting, but maybe for another time. So to cut someone off without being dismissive.
Yes.
So to have very clear context or boundaries for this session.
I think for me, so there's a couple of considerations. First of all, is you can't fully make, when we're talking about inclusivity, I want to go back quite just a step, because I think it's a really important point, is that we can't integrate everything in a single session. That's kind of what we're talking about here on some level. We need to be able to boundary the session so that it takes a reasonable amount of time. And also so that anything that we might come across unexpectedly isn't overwhelming. So it's boundaried, so it's contained. And that makes it safe enough. Not fully safe, because these things always happen in context. And I think this is one of the things, is however much you can establish ground rules, that isn't actually how power operationalizes in organizations after you leave the workshop. If you reveal something about yourself in those contexts and the wider practices of the organization are not healthy and safe, it is not safe to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So, and yes, you can push that edge a bit, in a workshop, and then but then that you push the edge and then it's integrated, and then you push the edge again, rather than being able to go a really long way there, so that that gap is a safe enough amount. If someone's pushed and shares something slightly difficult in the workshop, and then it results in negative consequences, that those negative consequences aren't overwhelming for the individual. And so that's kind of what I mean by that kind of boundary. The other thing for me around this is when we talk about what is helpful and what isn't, is that anything in this space of uncertainty is, we don't know what's helpful and until it's there and what's in front of us. What we can know is some of the things that have worked before, and we can have a list of things that have worked before, and we can be good at those things, but we can't know for sure which one to use and when, and whether it's really going to help. And so if when someone else raises something, we can bring that in, it's an invitation. Is it useful? We can try it out. We can build that kind of meta level skill of figuring out how something is useful. What use can we put it to? Is it useful now to what we're trying to achieve? Can we remember what we're trying to achieve, or do we get lost in the detail, or do we get lost in the big picture? Can we keep a focus on the frame that we agreed at the beginning? And it's absolutely okay to kind of experiment and diverge and be like, well, we're going off on a bit of a tangent. But how much of a tangent? How far do we want to go? When do we want to call this? And those are all felt skills. Those are all very much judgment, and arise from an awareness and a perception and a practice at being in those spaces. And they're what kind of give us the self-assurance to work in uncertainty, rather than needing to create certainty to feel safe.
Mm. And I would rather see it the other way around, that we do need the safe space in order to feel comfortable in uncertainty.
Yeah, we need a safe enough space, but uncertainty is, you can't make uncertainty completely safe.
I think it depends on the definition of safe. If safe is the absence of stress, no. And still, whether we consider something a stressful or an exciting situation is up to ourselves, because physically we feel the same, right? So for me, then it would be the task to create a container that either translates stress into excitement and hence uncertainty into a field of opportunities instead of a field of overwhelm. Mm-hmm. So it's basically an entire set of reframing, or setting boundaries and guidelines to make sure that everything that happens is okay and does not. And I think, and there comes the safety in, because you mentioned the outside, what happens after the workshop, that an idea is treated as an idea and it's nothing personal. So I think that's the most important thing for me, to create the sense of safety in a workshop.
Yeah, I think for me, I don't believe anything in uncertainty. When I say safe, it's often taken to mean without the capacity for harm, and that we might encounter some harm in a workshop. We might encounter some things that are unpleasant and difficult and hurtful in a workshop. And trying to create a situation where that doesn't arise at all prevents it from being, prevents it from actually doing very much at all. But neither should it be too much. This is what I mean by the calibration, is that and again, is like if we go back to the mountain climbing metaphor, the small hills are pretty safe. You can't actually die, unless you try really, really hard and things go really, really wrong on a little hill. Whereas you very much can on Everest. That it is demonstrably less safe in that sense. So the possibility of outcomes within that field of possibility, there is significant harm. But you can only do the really, really powerful work in a field of possibility where there is some harm as well. And therein lies this thing around influence rather than control. So for me, if we talk of control, we narrow the range of outcomes down. So we're back to this narrow, but that narrows at both edges. So we cut off the really, really harmful ones, but we also cut off the really great ones. So this narrowing is actually how control works. And it's interesting, when we try and control things, we get very tense as well. We physically narrow and tighten. So it's about constraining those outcomes. Whereas if we have influence, we're saying, yes, these possibilities are in the space, and we use our skillfulness to navigate towards the ones that are more desirable. But that means, we can't completely cut off the other ones.
And it's a good point what you mentioned about safe enough. If the definition of safety is the absence of harm, no matter what we do, we'll never be completely safe. Because even if we do nothing, there might be a person who feels incredibly threatened and insecure when nothing happens.
Yes.
Many cannot meditate because of the silence and the absence of things. So assuming that we are all neurodivergent in some sense, we are all functioning differently cognitively, then we cannot create a space that feels safe for everyone. And I'm thinking of an instance where we had an exercise where it was about speaking out, as participants speaking out our name. And one of the participants got really triggered by that. So we had an entire conversation about the notion of psychological safety and what we can and cannot do in a workshop, which then boiled down. So if we cannot ask our participants to say their name, what is there left? And whose responsibility is that? So
I think this also relates to one of the things around allowing people within a context to participate to the level that they feel comfortable. Because this is one of the other things I find is one of the other ways to make something safe enough is, yes, we can trust our own experiencing as facilitators, but we must also trust other people's experience and other people's judgment about their appropriate level. And for me, that should always take primacy. Is the individual's experiencing of the world is correct until proven, until we can really be very clear that there isn't something otherwise, because we always have to take their word for it at first pass. So if someone says this exercise is too much for me, that must be okay. The workshop must work with that from a design perspective, and the group must be okay with that from a social perspective. So I think for me, it's that it has to be an invitation. It has to be an invitation initially as well, which is one of the difficult things in organization sometimes, where you're like, one of my terms of working is that people must be freely invited and must have an option not to come. Because this space is consequential, it is dangerous. There is a risk of harm, and it's an individual's free choice to decide whether that is right for them right now, not their managers.
Yes. Which then involves an entire different level of inner work of the facilitator. So if we're genuinely inviting all emotions and all reactions in, and invite everyone, and I think that comes back also to the boundary setting and the framing in the beginning. So if we invite participants to only participate if they really feel comfortable, but then at the same time providing the space or inviting them to leave their comfort zone because it's safe enough.
Yes.
Then if someone decides not to participate, how to make sure that this is okay, but still not interrupting, that we are not taking it personally, because this also happens. We have this entire kind of additional dialogue happening between our ears. I think it becomes even more important to, as I mentioned, setting the boundaries or the container in the beginning. And the way how I imagine it now is to assume that everyone is free to say no and set their boundaries, and thereby we can trust that everything is okay unless someone tells us it's not okay.
Yes.
And then it's their responsibility and not ours.
Yes, that establishing of a set of principles, an agreed set of principles, and I think this is one of the other things, is it's really important to negotiate and agree with at the outset to create that safe enough space. It's like, what boundaries do we all care about right now? Here are some that I like, and perhaps some that I feel I require to be safe as a facilitator, because that's an important part of it. We're there too, and we need to make sure that we are safe as a facilitator.
As a very first step, actually.
Absolutely.
Because if we don't feel safe, we cannot.
How can we help anyone else feel comfortable in that environment? Absolutely. So we start with where we are and so, well, do you have a problem? Are any of these difficult to you? Are there anything else you would like to add? Would you like to clarify any of these? Would you like to change the wording? That kind of first coming to a group agreement, and it becomes that kind of temporary agreement that holds the space for the period. Essentially that is what kind of defines the space, the boundaries. That's how we take a first pass at figuring out what is safe enough.
Which reminds me of an interview I had with a game designer, and where they define the rules of the game, and the game being the workshop beforehand. And this then also makes very clear, okay, as soon as we're exiting this space, this game, there are different rules that apply. So also to make it clear that the transition to the real world in an organization where maybe different rules apply.
I think this connects with something very closely related, but there's an important differentiation here between the kind of work that is boundaried but in the same context, and work that is playful in the sense of is a known, temporary, provisional, and non-serious, i.e. the connected context. And it's really important, that suspension of some of the rules, some of the associations, so that we can try other ones on, so that we can experience them on a lived level. How does it feel to be this way, to interact this way? How does it feel if I don't do that? Because we're very poor at predicting how we feel based on projecting those things into the future. It's just a very, very hard thing to do. It's not that that's not a flaw in humanity. It's just an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and we don't do it very well, reliably. So we have to really feel into things, and that can result in coming up with too much. The reason that the playfulness is helpful is because if it is too much, it's provisional. We just go back. Whereas there is a different sort of workshop where we're actually engaging with the reality of it, with more connection with what's really there, where we don't really have the option of going back quite as easily. So that's the more consequential space. So the two work together, and being clear which one we're in is really, really important, because often that's when things get better. It's like, are we just playing? Are we just acting? Are we pretending? Or are we serious here? And being able to differentiate those is a really, really important part of it.
And then there's the entire space of serious games
The
and using games as a concept or a method that doesn't need necessarily to be play.
It's playful, but it's with consequential stuff, big stuff. And
Yes.
for me, that's one of the big markers of cognitive maturity, actually, the extent to which we can be playful, because that means allowing for outcomes that do have real harm. That means trying stuff on that might have real consequences.
Mm.
How can we be playful in that space? So for me, that's when it starts to get really interesting. That is my interesting space. That's an edge. And that's a difficult edge for a lot of people. The extent to which I could take a group right to that edge. Can you play with your fundamental way of seeing the world collectively as an organization now in this workshop? That's not something you can just invite a bunch of people to randomly without a lot of prior work, because it can be very destabilizing, very troubling.
So what I'm thinking of is playing, air quotes, with topics like identity, with beliefs, with belief systems, maybe values, or our understanding how the world functions. Can you give an example?
So one of the really the most difficult thing for many people is encountering a coherent but different perspective, way of being.
Threatening.
It's a kind of ontological threat. It's a threat to a perspective, because it's something outside of my view. When we really encounter the other, particularly when we encounter the other in us,
Cognitive dissonance.
It's cognitive dissonance, and the extent to which we experience that in any context, and it really depends on the organization, on the particular situation. But yes, it's that encounter with the internalized contradictions and the paradoxes, and the ability to hang in that space and play in that space,
where both can be true at the same time, although
yes,
they're contradicting each other.
Well, you could there are different ways of describing this capability, but for me, as a core skill of engaging with uncertainty well, it's absolutely up there. Sometimes it's called metacognitive flexibility. Sometimes it's called, John Keats called it negative capability. So this skill of really being able to work in that space, and I think for those of us, when we're talking about creativity, when I talk about creativity, I think about it in quite an applied way. My domain of creativity is applied. It's not about creativity for its own sake in the same way as someone who is an artist or a musician as the majority of what they do. For me, I'm really interested in how that creativity relates to then the more concrete world and what we do. And those of us who work in organizations in this space very often bridge that divide. And that creativity is about like taking different perspectives and joining them together in new ways. That's where that kind of integrative, synthetic creativity comes from. Mm-hmm. That means being able to hold that stuff in your head. And what we're doing very often is we're helping people experience that and develop all of the skills around that and relate to it their own way and find their own paths in that, get comfortable enough and develop their own way of being in that space so that they can then be creative in their own way.
Do you have a tip on how to get there, or how to test it out if it feels too daring?
I think for me, a lot of this actually comes down to letting people make their own judgment. We're not primarily placed to be able to work out whether it is too much for someone else. They are, because they have more privileged access to their experiencing of the world than anyone else. So it's about how we can really clearly lay this stuff out in a way that is transparent on a qualitative level. You can't be transparent on an outcome level because you don't know what those outcomes are necessarily. So you can't be like this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen, which is what some people mean by that. But you can give a sense, a feel. So really giving that kind of qualitative level and then linking it up with some possible outcomes is like, is this the kind of thing you want to experience, and are these the kind of things you want to happen? So it's more on that categoric level. And also, like, what level? So does this feel too much? Do you read this and you go like, ugh? Or are you like, oh, this is exciting, or this is exciting but too much, and getting that feedback and establishing that ground, that space is for me, and we're constantly iterating towards a space where we can try it out. So we're kind of experimenting into the thing, so feeling into the right level for a group of people. And there are things you can do. You can look for more concrete, more external tells. Certain people who've trained in certain things or experienced certain things are much more likely to have developed a set of skills in a certain space, or certain people who are in a certain neurominority or in other minorities are likely to have developed certain skills in a certain space. So you can say, again, these kind of people, or, you can talk, but you have to be talking in the kind of examples rather than actualities.
Mm-hmm. So would it then mean to start with getting comfortable with apparently opposing ideas? So, for instance, I think there's a liberating structure. Is it the wicked question? Is it possible that we are in an organization that is very top down and risk averse and still have a high autonomy of the individual employee?
Yeah.
So you would start with these kind of, and just explore how comfortable it feels and where the individual participants are going with something like that?
I think for me, when we're talking, it depends what level we're talking at. If we're talking before we're actually hosting the workshop and when we're setting the context, because a lot of the work happens beforehand, this is one of the other things, is the extent to which we can push the boundaries of how an organization thinks are partly dependent on the context and what the leadership are inviting us in for and their ability. So one of the most unkind things we can do is make a whole bunch of people aware of a whole load of possibilities that they can't possibly realize for structural reasons. That's not a helpful thing for anyone.
That's risky. It's not only uncertain, it is risky.
This is a cost. This is why this is what you so like being aware of what is intended at all levels. What's the underlying intent? What's the energy? What am I trying to resolve here? And what are we allowing in that space? Because if people aren't allowed, essentially, we are just playing, but we're saying we're not playing, and that's really difficult. And it's like it's that the seeing of how things could be, but that I can't realize for structural reasons isn't helpful. And it isn't helpful to the leadership either, because it becomes distracting, it becomes friction. So it's like, how far are we pushing this? And yes, you can push the edge a bit again, but like understanding that context is a really important part of this. You end up, so you're kind of between whomever, particularly in organizations, you're between whomever decided the thing was a good idea and the people that turn up.
And hopefully being invited and having a role there. So if I understand you correctly, then it would start with, again, boundaries or defining what is actually the canvas with the hiring client or the leadership. Okay, so what is inside, what is outside the frame of possibilities? And then we can play with the uncertainty within this framework.
And one way to look at that is, what can we question?
I like that.
What questions can we ask? Because if we come up with an alternative answer, What's seen can't be unseen. That's the problem. When I say this work is consequential, that's one of the ways it's consequential. So
And
if we question something fundamental, that then cannot be, that other people are, that is a boundary for others, we can introduce a lot of conflict and difficulty.
would you have, because if I imagine the situation sitting in front of the leadership, okay, so what can we question? I love the idea of it. The way how I imagine it in practice is that you get kind of the standard things that are rather risk averse or feel safe to the leadership, and that you might not be able to actually go to the edges and to explore, okay, maybe there are different layers that we could question, that we could address, but they are not aware of. So do you have a kind of a checklist of, okay, can we question this? Can we question the pricing, the product, the way of working, the hierarchy?
The way I would normally approach it is, when someone invites you in for a specific thing, is that there's a kind of implied boundary to be pushing, an implied edge that they want to develop. As actually part of this kind of sales setup conversation, I would already be exploring what that really is with those people. So it's almost like, it's like, if we're facilitating, we should, our kind of sales and setup process is also facilitative. It's that how we get to that point is also is a similar cycle. That way we know that edge already. We kind of, so we've got a more physical, intuitive sense of where that is, and we've got the kind of language and the words and the feel for it as well, because we've already explored that with others, and if we're sensitive to that, we pick it up without even consciously being aware of it. We know we'll feel the tension in the room when we say a certain thing without necessarily even consciously registering it, or just go in and we'll be like, okay, not there now, or like, and we will kind of, and the extent to which people are comfortable with that, or some people will be, you'll be able to, some people who are more highly self-aware will notice themselves, and then you'll be able to get direct feedback from them as well, which is helpful. And if you don't get that, that's also an interesting tell in and of itself, because it tells you that whoever brought you in is not sufficiently self-aware to do that in that space, and that therefore you need to be mindful of the fact that they're not.
What is your number one facilitation challenge?
I think for me, it is, at its deepest level, is that the domain of the work that we have spoken about for the whole of this podcast is poorly understood, is not well educated, is not widely really known. It's a bit of a dark art, it's and that has all sorts of problems, because it means that it's very hard to find tools that will support this work digitally in particular. It's very hard to explain to people really what it is. We've spent a long time picking all this apart, this uncertainty work. This isn't an opportunity that you get with a large organization necessarily. So if I have to explain what this is and how it works, it's actually quite difficult to convey that message so people can make their own informed decision about whether it's appropriate or not for them right now. It also, because it's not well understood and a lot of people haven't had that much experience of it, leads to a lot of fear that's unnecessary. So that control influence thing, the need, the idea that what what are you doing with a bunch of people and you don't even know what you're doing? It's like, well, if you understand the work and you've done a bit of it yourself, you have a much greater sense of it. But because we don't educate people into this very much, there's a very high, there are those of us who just kind of pop into it for circumstantial reasons. It finds us, and then there's everyone else who can be quite mistrustful of it. And I think particularly in my experience in larger organizations, that's the middle management layer. They tend to be, the people on the ground see directly experience the contradictions and the problems and have to negotiate them all day because that's their job, and they're kind of the subject of the power relations. The people at the top have that kind of high view and can see those things. People in the middle layer often don't, and their incentives aren't necessarily very helpful to helping them do that. And they don't necessarily have a set of skills that really support them in doing that either. And so it creates this feedback loop around fear and not wanting to do it and not wanting to change and not wanting to explore. So I think for me, the biggest challenge is that uncertainty work, this working at edges, working with edges, working in this exploratory and integrative space doesn't have neat names, doesn't have good language, doesn't have the set of support around it that other domains of work do.
Mm-hmm. And I find it, thank you for elaborating that. I think it makes so much sense. And I wonder whether there might be ways to at least get a better sense. So even if they don't understand what uncertainty means, but they definitely know the emotion and the fear that goes along. And it makes a lot of sense that actually the middle management has a higher aversion against uncertainty because they have to report to the top and they have to control the bottom. So if they have uncertainty in both directions, that causes an incredible amount of stress because it's out of control. Basically, where you hire middle management to increase control.
Yeah, they're being
at least predictability.
Asked to integrate the unintegrable. I can't quite find the word, but yes, they're asked to integrate what cannot be integrated.
Yeah, and then I wonder whether maybe a self-test. Don't we all love self-tests? About how comfortable do I feel with uncertainty? And what does it actually mean for the workshop? So to at least mentally prepare those who will come to what might happen and what might be good coping strategies.
I think so. And also being clear about the benefits of why you engage with this stuff. Because for many people who experience this, because they are capable of engaging with uncertainty through perspective and through different experiences, they perceive threats and opportunities that others just can't. When you are in a situation where you can share that and work with that, that's great. That's you being valued. That's really lovely. Most people do not experience that. They experience real difficulty conveying those ideas, having to make a huge amount of effort to explain them and not having them understood. That leads to frustration, where we're talking about opportunities, because there's a brilliant thing over there and we're all going over here instead. Brilliant, thanks, great. And anxiety in the case of threats. It's like we're all sailing, the ship is sailing at an iceberg. No one else sees the iceberg, but and you can see it. And so that creates a huge amount of anxiety. So, when we're talking about we can work with some of those and channel some of those feelings into more positive change if we're allowed those degrees of freedom. So I think for me, there's both thinking of, yes, people who find the work a challenge, and then there's thinking of people who find the existing working situation a challenge because it is not to the level that it's not meeting, it's not actually at that level for them yet. So there's the two different groups, and how we're working with which ones we choose to work with, which one we think is most helpful to work with right now, which ones we as an individual enjoy working with.
Which, funny enough, links back to the question we parked at the very beginning, I think minute 5 of our conversation, how to the uncertainty from the perspective of the facilitator in the group.
Yeah.
So thank you. What makes a workshop work? What makes a workshop fail?
It depends entirely on whether you have what your intent with the workshop is, first of all. And there are two broad intents. There is one to come out with something specific. In that case, that is a failure of control. You know, if we are aiming for something specific, we need to be clear about what we're aiming for, and we need to do everything to achieve that. So that is a lack of control. However, in this uncertainty space, as we've said, we can't really have that. So for me, what makes a workshop a failure, or the metric by which a workshop is a failure, is whether or not it was worth doing. Whether or not the whole range of outcomes justify the resources, people's time, people's energy, money, whatever, that went into setting it up. And those divide, yes, into kind of concrete outcomes, but they also are on a more learning basis. You know, what we have learnt was knowing this, whether or not it worked in a sense of created the outcome we expected, valuable. And that's the best way we can hedge against uncertainty. It's like, if we are going to learn something that's of more value than the concrete things that we're putting into it, then it almost doesn't matter whether we can have a specific outcome. And that's really helpful, because if we get fixated because we need a specific outcome, we're not going to learn very much about the space, because we're just going to be heading for that outcome.
It's again this kind of
the tightness,
tense,
exactly,
the tightening,
the narrowness. So being able to be like, well, if this succeeds in the sense of what we set up to as an outcome, brilliant. If it fails, that what we learn from that failure is worth more than what we put into it in the first place, then it's not really a failure. Though it's a really difficult word, because some people use failure to mean both the thing didn't happen as we expected, but we learned something really valuable from it, and this just wasn't worth doing.
And thank you for the differentiation. And this opens an entire other Pandora box, because whether or not it was valuable sometimes only shows up much later. I remember that some of the worst experiences I had are the ones that actually helped me most, but I only realized after I had digested all these kind of emotions. And then the question is it what defines valuable in terms of learning? Is every experience we have a valuable learning, although it might be painful? So you really need then a growth mindset, and then it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then there's never failure, because if you have a growth mindset, almost you can find a learning or an experience in almost everything you do.
That's true up to a point. The thing is, where we experience harm, either because psychological hurt, harm, it's difficult to engage with at that time, or physical harm or anything else, is that requires resources to recover, to heal. We only have a finite amount of those resources. So it isn't desirable to seek those experiences.
Very good point. Thank you.
It doesn't mean that, again, it's related to this idea of being, we don't want to shy away from them completely, and we don't want to make them not something that we can ever encounter, but we want to orient towards joyful, healthy, happy, kind of experiences that we come away from feeling nourished. Because for me, that's the most immediate marker of whether something's going to serve us long term. The reason that joy, I think, on some level exists, when I say the reason, because I'm in this space of reasoning and causal, in the head about this, is because it makes us do things that are good for us in the long run.
Yeah, dopamine rush is based in learning stuff and
Exactly.
repeating it. And we learn best through emotions.
And being able to kind of
Maybe
connect
only.
with that. If we enjoy the experience, it's telling us, okay, that was probably useful for a later time. So that for me is more important. It's a marker of built capacity, of created opportunity. So when we're talking about working in uncertainty, what we're getting out of uncertainty is the opportunity that can then be realized by the more concrete work. So it's about creating that thing. It's like, sometimes I think of it as like it's a better question. This is why questioning again. But it's like, if we can, and then what we can do is answer that question better, which is the more concrete domain, and then we get, but because it's so, and it's joy that orients us towards this opportunity stuff. So when we're working in uncertainty, what we're trying to do primarily is build opportunity. So for me, that's the marker. Yes, we can resolve stuff that's difficult, but ultimately we want to be orienting towards more joy, more ease in how we engage with things that are difficult, things that are serious, things that are hard, because that's what makes them more tractable, more easy, more within our realm of control.
Yeah, I think we mentioned that before, the rephrasing or reframing of uncertainty into opportunity, possibility. And then it almost sounds to me as if the role of the facilitator is to create sufficient curiosity so that the participants find comfort in this uncertainty. No, not comfort, because comfort sounds like resting, but curiosity to investigate further, and then also to be open to explore the different paths, because most of the time the real work starts after the workshop. And that's where very often the workshop, air quotes, fails, when everyone is excited inside, but nothing happens afterwards.
Yeah.
But actually what you want to do is to create the spillover effect.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think the curiosity is so important. I might say more a place where people's innate curiosity can emerge and be expressed in ways that they haven't been able to before, either because it didn't feel safe or because they didn't have the tools or whatever. So it's more about creating that context in which different things can be expressed that are already in the field, innate, and bringing them into a shared reality so that we can then use them.
Yeah.
And I completely agree that if we just do that and we bracket it off completely, we don't get much of the value of having done that. And as I've said, it's, there's a cost to doing this, so we don't, it's not necessarily a wise thing. And that's why knowing what are our degrees of application, what can we do with this, and that kind of closing so we can open another cycle. It's like, what's the next step? It's like, we've done one cycle. Do we want to carry on doing this the same? Do we want to alter it? Do we want to go off? That's always the next bit. And for me, that's not always, as a facilitator, a lot of my work is intended to get to the point at which people don't need to work with me anymore. In fact, all of my work is, because I want them to develop the capability themselves. So there's always that question. So are we done? Do you want some more? Do we want to do this now? Do we want to wait? And that then is like, okay, we've got this. How do we then do this next cycle? And that's where the next bit ends. and then helping people, pointing them in where I know to be, or I expect to be, a helpful direction with where we have got to.
Love that. And also, again, thinking in cycles defines very clear boundaries, very clear restrictions.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've covered a lot. Is there still something that you have the impression that you wanted to share, but you didn't get to sharing?
I think I'd like to just to maybe slightly wrap up and bring a couple of those the ideas we've been touching on together. Is that we have a preference, often a learnt preference, I suspect, for thinking in terms of things being this kind of causal, this happens, then that happens, and it all being really neat, and us being, and everything going in one direction, this directionality, linear thinking. And that's not to say it's not very useful a lot of the time, but there is a whole other domain of thinking which is much more cyclic, process orientated, much more like how life itself works, that has this massive value to everyone, even those whose primary skills are linear thinking. And I think for me, I would really love people to go away with the idea that this is something they can do if they are excited by what we've talked about, and that there are increasingly kind of bunches of us getting together and talking about this, like on this show, and that it is valuable and important, on some level really important, because it joins up stuff that no one else can join up, and that, as you said, absolutely, uncertainty into opportunity is really this thing. Another way of looking at uncertainty is possibility. And those of us who feel that on a really deep level, we've often had a difficult time because of that. And I would like really to say that there is huge value in it. If that is you, then brilliant. If it isn't you, you're probably not made it to the end of this conversation anyway. But if it isn't you, then I'd really ask you to look for the value in others who do have that.
Thank you so much for wrapping it up and inviting the audience to join the conversation.
Absolutely.
Different ways.
The more of a conversation, the more, it is. I want it to be clear. It's a helpful thing for me to add at the end. Everything I've said is conversational, is not the absolute truth, is to be questioned, challenged, explored. It's not, this. We don't progress this by creating another fixed orthodoxy.
Yes, that's why this podcast is very little edited. It's just thinking together.
Absolutely.
And playing with thoughts.
Absolutely.
Thank you for playing with me.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, for hosting, and for holding the space, and for sharing, going on the journey, or exploring alongside, because it's one of the things, I think, if you are given to this, is not everyone can go with you in this, and it's a real pleasure to find other people that can, and very much a real pleasure to do that with you. So thank you.
Thank you. And if the audience wants to hear more of you, from you, with you, work with you, I will put the links to the show notes, including your own podcast and YouTube channel.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much.
Dum, da, da, dum. This is the end of the podcast, Jingle.